I was sitting in my late uncle's cabin in the woods outside Asheville, North Carolina, watching the sunrise through the pine trees when I heard the aggressive knocking that would change everything. The cabin had been mine for exactly 3 weeks since Uncle Harold passed, and I had spent every available weekend since then making the 2-hour drive from Charlotte to fix up the place. The woman at the door looked like she had been born angry, her blonde hair cut in that aggressive bob that practically screamed entitlement, and her hands were already on her hips before I even opened the door all the way. "Excuse me, but this property has been abandoned for over 90 days, she announced, thrusting a clipboard toward my face. "I'm Patricia Henderson, president of the Mountain View Estates Homeowners Association, and I'm here to inform you that we've begun proceedings to claim this structure under North Carolina abandoned property statutes." I blinked at her coffee mug still in my hand. "I'm sorry, what?" "This isn't abandoned. I'm Lucas Thompson, and I inherited this cabin from my uncle 3 weeks ago. The probate court just finalized everything." Patricia's eyes narrowed like a hawk spotting prey. 3 weeks. This property has been clearly abandoned since last November. No one has maintained the grounds, there's been no activity, and according to our bylaws, any property that falls into disrepair becomes subject to HOA intervention. "Wait, hold on," I said, setting my mug down on the nearest surface. "My uncle died in January. The probate process takes time. And since when is this cabin even part of an HOA? Uncle Harold never mentioned anything about that." She smiled the kind of smile that made my skin crawl. "Your uncle may not have been informed when the community voted to expand our jurisdiction last year. We sent notices to all properties within our expanded boundaries." Expanded boundaries. You can't just decide you run someone's property because you feel like it. Patricia's expression shifted into something between condescension and triumph. "We absolutely can when property values are at stake. This cabin has become an eyesore, and it's affecting the entire community. I have documentation right here showing that we've followed all proper procedures." She flipped through pages on her clipboard with practiced efficiency. Multiple notices, photographic evidence of abandonment, and a declaration of intent to claim filed with the county. My heart started pounding. "You filed something with the county about my property without contacting me." "We contacted the last known owner, who we assumed was Harold Thompson. The mail was returned as undeliverable to the deceased. That constitutes proper notification under our interpretation of the guidelines." I felt my jaw clench. "Your interpretation? Lady, I don't know what you think you're doing, but this cabin is legally mine. I have the probate court documents, the deed transfer, everything. You need to leave my property right now." Patricia's face flushed red, and I could see her knuckles turning white as she gripped her clipboard. "How dare you speak to me like that? I am trying to maintain property values for everyone in this community, and I will not be dismissed by some outsider who can't even be bothered to maintain basic landscaping standards." Outsider. This was my uncle's cabin for 30 years, and I've been here every weekend working on it. 3 weekends of sporadic activity doesn't negate months of abandonment, she snapped. "And frankly, I question whether you actually have legitimate claim to this property. Anyone could show up and claim they inherited something." That's when I realized this wasn't just about property maintenance or HOA regulations. Patricia Henderson had her eyes on this land for some reason, and she had clearly thought she could just swoop in and take it while everyone assumed it was abandoned during probate. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures of her and her clipboard. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, documenting this conversation. "And I'm going to contact my lawyer first thing Monday morning. If you filed anything claiming my property, we're going to have a serious problem." Patricia straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. "I wouldn't threaten me if I were you. The HOA has significant resources and legal precedent on our side. I suggest you attend our meeting next Thursday at 7 p.m. so we can discuss this properly. Bring whatever documentation you claim to have." She spun on her heel and marched back toward a white Lexus SUV parked in front of the cabin. I stood in the doorway, feeling my peaceful weekend evaporating into stress and anger. Uncle Harold had left me this cabin specifically because he knew how much I loved this place. I had spent childhood summers here, learning to fish in the creek that ran through the back of the property, helping him chop wood for the winter, sitting on this very porch listening to his stories. The idea that some power-hungry HOA president thought she could just claim it made my blood boil. After Patricia drove away, I spent an hour searching through Uncle Harold's files that I had been slowly organizing. He was meticulous about keeping records, and sure enough, I found correspondence from the Mountain View Estates HOA dated 8 months ago. The letters claimed that the community had voted to expand their jurisdiction to include unincorporated properties within a half-mile radius of the existing HOA boundaries, and demanded that Uncle Harold pay back fees totaling nearly $8,000. Uncle Harold had apparently replied with a strongly worded letter from his attorney stating that his property had never been part of any HOA, that he had not agreed to any such jurisdiction, and that the HOA had no legal authority to impose fees or regulations on his land. The last letter in the file was from Patricia Henderson herself, dated just 2 weeks before Uncle Harold's death, threatening legal action and claiming that his continued refusal to participate in community standards would result in appropriate measures. I photographed every single document and immediately called my friend Derek, who practiced real estate law in Charlotte. He didn't answer, but I left a detailed voicemail explaining the situation and asking him to call me back as soon as possible. The rest of the weekend, I couldn't shake the feeling that Patricia was planning something. I walked the property line, checking the survey markers that Uncle Harold had always been careful to maintain. The cabin sat on 12 acres of beautiful wooded land, with the creek running along the eastern boundary and a small meadow to the south, where Uncle Harold used to keep a vegetable garden. The nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away through the trees. I drove down to the main road and started looking at the other properties in the area. That's when I noticed the signs. Mountain View Estates markers appeared at regular intervals, fancy stone pillars with brass plaques announcing the community. But the weird thing was, most of the houses I could see didn't look like they were part of any coordinated development. They were a mix of older cabins like Uncle Harold's, newer construction, and a few double-wide trailers. It didn't look like a traditional HOA neighborhood at all. At a small gas station about 2 miles from the cabin, I struck up a conversation with the clerk, an older man named Jimmy, who said he had lived in the area his whole life. "Mountain View Estates," he said, shaking his head. "Yeah, that's Patricia Henderson's pet project. She and her husband bought up a bunch of lots about 5 years ago, built themselves a fancy house, and then decided everyone around them needed to live up to their standards. They got enough of the new residents to vote in an HOA, and then they started trying to expand it to include all the old-timers who'd been here for decades. Can they actually do that? Just force people into an HOA?" Jimmy shrugged. "Been some legal fights about it. Most of the old-timers told them to shove it, but Patricia's husband Greg is some kind of corporate attorney, and they've got money to burn on legal fees. They've been wearing people down, making their lives miserable until they either pay up or sell out. I heard they got 3 properties that way already. What do you mean? Got 3 properties. Bought them for way under market value after harassing the owners with fines and legal threats. Then they flipped them to their developer buddies. There's talk of putting in a whole resort development up on the ridge, but they need more land for it. Word is, they've been targeting the holdouts. My stomach sank. And one of those holdouts was Harold Thompson. Jimmy's expression softened. Harold was good people, real sorry about his passing. He told Patricia where she could stick her HOA fees more than once. Made her madder than a hornet. I thanked Jimmy for the information and headed back to the cabin, my mind racing. This wasn't just about property maintenance or community standards. Patricia and her husband were running some kind of land grab scheme, using the HOA as a weapon to force people out so they could acquire property cheaply and profit from development deals. Derek called me back that evening. Lucas, this sounds like a mess. But the good news is, if you have clear probate court documents showing you inherited the property, their abandonment claim won't hold up. The bad news is, you're probably going to have to fight this in court, and that takes time and money. What about their claim that they expanded the HOA to include Uncle Harold's property? That's trickier. North Carolina law does allow HOAs to expand under certain circumstances, but there are specific procedures they have to follow. They can't just unilaterally declare jurisdiction over properties that never agreed to be part of the HOA. Did Harold ever sign any documents agreeing to join? Not that I've found. He actually had you write a letter telling them to back off. Wait, I wrote that letter. Hold on, let me pull the file. I heard Derek typing in the background. Oh yeah, Harold Thompson, I remember this. Yeah, we told them they had no authority. Did they drop it? Not exactly. They kept threatening him, and now they're claiming the property was abandoned and trying to take it. Derek let out a low whistle. That's bold, and potentially illegal. If they knowingly filed false abandonment claims, that could be fraud. Do you have the probate documents handy? Yeah, everything's finalized. The court issued the deed transfer to me on February 2nd. Okay, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to file a motion with the county to challenge any claims they've filed against the property. I'll also send them a cease and desist letter making it clear that you're the legal owner and that any further harassment will result in legal action. But Lucas, you need to be prepared for this to get ugly. If what you're telling me about their development scheme is true, they're not going to back down easily. I don't care. Uncle Harold left me this cabin, and I'm not letting some wannabe land baron steal it. That's the spirit. Can you come by my office Monday morning? Bring every document you have related to the property, the probate case, and all correspondence with the HOA. I agreed and spent the rest of Sunday organizing files and making copies of everything. By the time I drove back to Charlotte that evening, I had 2 thick folders of documentation and a growing sense that I was in for a long fight. Monday morning, I met Derek at his office in uptown Charlotte. He reviewed all the documents I had brought and nodded approvingly. This is good. You have a clear chain of ownership, proper probate proceedings, and documentation of their harassment of your uncle. The fact that they threatened him shortly before his death and then immediately moved to claim the property looks really bad for them. So what's our next move? I'm going to file a declaratory judgment action asking the court to confirm your ownership and reject any HOA claims. I'll also send that cease and desist letter today. And I think we should file a complaint with the North Carolina Real Estate Commission about their conduct. If they're using the HOA to run a land scheme, that needs to be investigated. The cease and desist letter went out that afternoon via email and certified mail. Derek didn't pull any punches. It stated clearly that I was the legal owner of the property, that the probate court had issued a final order transferring the deed, that the HOA had no jurisdiction over my land, and that any further attempts to claim or interfere with my property rights would result in legal action, including claims for harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and fraud. Patricia's response came within 2 hours. She called Derek's office directly, and he put her on speakerphone so I could listen. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she started, her voice dripping with indignation. "Your client is interfering with legitimate HOA business and disregarding months of proper legal procedures." Derek's voice was calm and professional. "Miss Henderson, my client is the legal owner of the property as established by the probate court. You have no claim to his land. We have documentation proving abandonment. We followed proper procedures. We posted notices. We attempted to contact the previous owner, and we filed the appropriate paperwork with the county. You filed paperwork claiming property that was actively going through probate proceedings. Those proceedings are a matter of public record. You could have easily checked with the court to see if there was an heir." There was a pause. "We had no obligation to investigate beyond the notices we posted. Actually, Miss Henderson, if you're claiming property under abandonment statutes, you do have an obligation to make reasonable efforts to locate the legal owner. Filing false abandonment claims could constitute fraud, and if you're using HOA authority to target properties for personal gain, that could be criminal." Patricia's voice went cold. "Are you threatening me? I'm informing you of the legal realities. My client has clear title to his property. You need to withdraw any claims immediately and cease any further interference with his property rights. We'll see what our attorney has to say about this." She hung up without another word. Derek looked at me and shook his head. "She's not going to back down. We need to be prepared for them to escalate." He was right. 2 days later, I received a thick envelope via certified mail from the law offices of Gregory Henderson, attorney at law. Inside was a lawsuit filed in county court claiming that I had interfered with HOA business, violated community standards, trespassed on HOA property, and failed to pay dues and fines totaling $12,000. They were seeking a court order forcing me to pay the fees plus their legal costs, and they were asking for a lien to be placed on the property. I immediately forwarded everything to Derek, who called me that evening sounding angry. "This is retaliation, plain and simple. They're trying to bury you in legal fees and intimidate you into settling. But here's the thing, everything in this lawsuit is baseless. You can't violate HOA rules when you're not part of the HOA, and you can't trespass on your own property. So what do? We file a motion to dismiss, and we counterclaim. We're going to go after them for harassment, abuse of process, and fraudulent lien claims. And I'm going to reach out to some of the other property owners in the area who have been fighting them. If we can show a pattern of this behavior, it strengthens our case significantly." Over the next week, Derek connected with 4 other property owners who had been targeted by Patricia's HOA scheme. An elderly couple named the Martins had been fighting them for 2 years over claims that their property violated setback requirements. A single mother named Rebecca Walsh had been hit with thousands of dollars in fines for having too many vehicles on her property. She ran a small auto repair business from her garage. A retired veteran named John Stevens was facing foreclosure threats over unpaid HOA fees that he insisted he never owed because his property was purchased before the HOA existed. Derek organized a meeting at his office with all of us. Hearing their stories made my blood boil. Patricia and her husband had been systematically targeting people they saw as vulnerable, burying them in legal paperwork and threatening their homes unless they paid up or sold out. "Has anyone reported this to the authorities?" I asked. John Stevens shook his head bitterly. I tried going to the sheriff's office. They said it was a civil matter and I needed to handle it through the courts, but I can't afford a lawyer, and that's exactly what they're counting on. Rebecca spoke up, her voice tight with stress. I'm a single mom with 3 kids. Every dollar I spend fighting them is a dollar I can't spend on my family. They know that. Patricia actually told me once that if I just sold my property to their approved buyer, all my problems would go away. Derek leaned forward. That's coercion. If we can prove they're using legal threats to force below-market sales, that's potentially extortion. The meeting lasted 3 hours, and by the end, we had formed a plan. Derek would represent all of us in a coordinated defense, and we would share the legal costs. More importantly, we would compile all our documentation and file a complaint not just with the Real Estate Commission, but with the North Carolina Attorney General's office and the FBI if necessary. The following Thursday, I showed up to the HOA meeting Patricia had demanded I attend. Derek came with me, along with John Stevens and the Martins. The meeting was held in a community center that apparently served the Mountain View Estates neighborhood, though it looked more like someone's oversized garage that had been converted into a meeting space. Patricia sat at a table at the front of the room with 2 other board members. A thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who was introduced as the treasurer, and a heavy-set woman who was apparently the secretary. Her husband Greg was there too, sitting in the front row with his arms crossed and a smug expression on his face. About 15 other people were scattered throughout the room, most of them looking uncomfortable. Patricia called the meeting to order and immediately launched into a speech about property values and community standards. We have several matters to address tonight, she announced, including ongoing violations by multiple property owners who refuse to comply with our bylaws. Her eyes locked onto me. Mr. Thompson, you were invited here to discuss the status of the property you claim to have inherited. Derek stood up before I could respond. Derek Morrison, attorney for Mr. Thompson. My client doesn't claim to have inherited the property. He legally inherited it through probate court proceedings. That's established fact, not a claim. Patricia's expression soured. We have procedures in place for dealing with abandoned properties. The property was never abandoned. It was going through probate, which is a standard legal process after someone passes away. You had no right to file abandonment claims, and you certainly have no right to try to seize property that has a clear legal owner. Greg Henderson stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. I'm Greg Henderson, attorney for the HOA. Mr. Morrison, your client is disrupting legitimate community business. We have documentation showing that property was neglected for months, creating an eyesore and depressing property values for the entire neighborhood. Your documentation doesn't change the fact that you don't have jurisdiction over that property. Harold Thompson never agreed to be part of your HOA, and neither has Lucas Thompson. You can't unilaterally impose your rules on properties that aren't part of your association. Patricia slammed her hand on the table. This is exactly the kind of obstructionist attitude that prevents our community from thriving. We have every right to enforce standards on properties within our boundaries. You expanded your boundaries without proper legal authority, Derek shot back. And based on my conversations with other property owners, it seems like you've been targeting specific properties that you want to acquire for development purposes. The room went very quiet. Greg's face flushed red. That's a baseless accusation and borderline slander. It's only slander if it's false, and I have multiple clients who are prepared to testify about the coercive tactics this HOA has been using. Several of the other attendees started whispering among themselves. An older man in the back raised his hand. Excuse me, but but I'd like to hear more about this. I've been getting letters about fees too, and I never agreed to join any HOA. Patricia pointed at him sharply. Mr. Kowalski, your concerns can be addressed at another time. Right now we're dealing with Mr. Thompson's violation. What violation? I stood up, unable to keep quiet any longer. I own my property. I've been working on it every weekend. I'm not part of your HOA, and I'm not going to be bullied into paying fees I don't owe or selling my land to your developer friends. Greg stepped into the aisle, his voice taking on a threatening tone. Young man, you're making some very serious accusations. I'd be careful about what you say in a public forum. Is that a threat? Derek moved to stand beside me. It's advice. Legal advice from an attorney who understands how defamation law works. John Stevens stood up from his seat. I'd like everyone here to know that this HOA has been trying to foreclose on my property for over a year. I'm a 72-year-old veteran, and they're trying to take my home over fees I never agreed to pay. The Martins stood up next. They've been harassing us for 2 years, Mrs. Martin said, her voice shaking. Sending inspectors to our property, taking pictures, sending threatening letters. All because we won't sell to them. More whispers rippled through the room. Several people pulled out their phones, either recording or taking notes. Patricia looked like she was about to explode. This meeting is out of order, she shouted. All of you need to leave. This is HOA business, and if you're not members in good standing, you're trespassing. Actually, HOA meetings in North Carolina are required to be open to all homeowners in the community, Derek said calmly. And since you claim my client's property is part of your community, he has every right to be here. Greg grabbed his briefcase and moved toward the door. Patricia, we're done here. These people clearly aren't interested in productive dialogue. That's right, run away, John Stevens called after him. Just like you run away every time someone challenges your scam. Greg spun around, his face purple with rage. You old fool, you don't know who you're dealing with. I will bury you in legal paperwork until you don't have a penny left to your name. That's a threat, Derek said immediately, pulling out his phone. And I recorded it. Everyone here heard you threaten my client with financially motivated legal harassment. Several other people held up their phones too. We recorded it too, someone called out. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Patricia was screaming about order and demanding people leave. Greg was trying to backtrack his threat while simultaneously arguing that it had been taken out of context. The other board members looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. Several of the attendees were arguing loudly, some supporting Patricia and others demanding answers about the HOA's activities. Derek guided me, John, and the Martins out of the building. Once we were outside in the parking lot, he couldn't suppress a grim smile. Well, that went better than I expected. Greg just handed us evidence of their coercive tactics on a silver platter. What happens now? I asked. Now we compile all of this and file a formal complaint with the Attorney General's office. We have threats, we have a pattern of harassment, and we have evidence that they're targeting properties for acquisition. That's enough to trigger an investigation. Over the next 2 weeks, things escalated rapidly. Derek filed our motion to dismiss the lawsuit against me and included counterclaims for harassment, abuse of process, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. He filed similar motions for his other clients. All the documentation, including recordings from the HOA meeting, was submitted to the North Carolina Attorney General's office with a detailed complaint alleging consumer fraud and coercive business practices. Patricia responded by doubling down. She sent me a certified letter claiming I owed $17,000 in fines for various violations, including unauthorized construction, improper landscaping, and failure to obtain HOA approval for repairs. Every single claimed violation was either made up or referred to basic maintenance work I had been doing on my own property. Then she made a critical mistake. She filed a lien against my property with the county clerk's office, claiming I owed the HOA money. Filing a false lien is a crime in North Carolina, and Derek immediately filed a criminal complaint with the district attorney's office. The lien also caught the attention of the title company that handled Uncle Harold's estate. They contacted me to ask about the claim, and when I explained the situation, they connected me with their legal department. It turned out that the title company had insurance that covered fraudulent lien claims, and they were very interested in pursuing action against Patricia and the HOA. Things came to a head in early April. The Attorney General's office opened a formal investigation into the Mountain View Estates HOA. They issued subpoenas for all HOA financial records, correspondence, and meeting minutes. They also subpoenaed records from Greg Henderson's law firm related to his work for the HOA. Patricia apparently panicked. She sent an email to all HOA members announcing an emergency meeting to discuss false allegations being made by disgruntled non-members. The email was forwarded to Derek by several recipients, and it was a goldmine of poor judgment. In it, Patricia admitted that the HOA had been proactive in identifying properties for community improvement, and that some owners had been resistant to progress. She claimed the investigation was just a bureaucratic annoyance that would blow over once they explained their position properly. The emergency meeting never happened. 2 days before it was scheduled, investigators from the Attorney General's office showed up at Patricia's house with a search warrant. They also executed warrants at Greg's law office and at the HOA's storage unit where they kept their records. Derek got a call from the lead investigator, a sharp woman named Sandra Chen. She wanted to interview all of us about our experiences with the HOA. We each spent several hours giving detailed statements and providing documentation. 3 weeks later, the news broke. The Attorney General's office filed criminal charges against Patricia Henderson, Greg Henderson, and the 2 other HOA board members. The charges included fraud, filing false liens, extortion, and conspiracy to commit fraud. According to the press release, the investigation had uncovered evidence that the Hendersons had used the HOA to target at least 11 properties for acquisition, that they had made more than $200,000 in profit from reselling properties they obtained through coercive tactics, and that they had filed false liens and legal claims against property owners who refused to comply with their demands. The press release also revealed something I hadn't known. Patricia and Greg had been planning to sell a large parcel of assembled properties to a resort developer for over $2 million. My uncle's cabin was right in the middle of that parcel, and without it, the deal would fall apart. That's why they had been so aggressive about claiming it was abandoned. The criminal case moved quickly. Greg tried to negotiate a plea deal, offering to testify against Patricia in exchange for reduced charges. But the evidence was so overwhelming that the prosecutors didn't need his testimony. They had financial records showing the money trail, emails discussing their strategy for targeting properties, and recordings of their threats against property owners. The trial was held in September. I attended every day, sitting in the courtroom gallery and watching as the prosecution systematically destroyed any pretense that the Hendersons had been acting in good faith. They called property owners who testified about being threatened and harassed. They presented evidence of the fake violations and inflated fines. They showed how the Hendersons had manipulated HOA votes to expand their jurisdiction, recruiting new residents who were promised benefits if they supported the expansion, while simultaneously keeping older residents in the dark about what was happening. The most damning testimony came from a real estate developer named Marcus Shaw, who had been negotiating with the Hendersons to purchase the assembled properties. He testified that Greg had explicitly told him they were clearing out the old property owners to make way for the resort development, and that Patricia had assured him they would have all the necessary parcels within 6 months. Patricia tried to play the victim on the stand, claiming she was just trying to improve the community and that she had been misunderstood. But the prosecutor tore her apart on cross-examination, confronting her with her own emails and statements. When asked why she had filed an abandonment claim on my property just 3 weeks after Uncle Harold's death, she couldn't give a coherent answer. Greg didn't even testify. His lawyer apparently advised him that anything he said would only make things worse. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found both Patricia and Greg Henderson guilty on all counts. The other 2 board members were convicted of lesser charges for their participation in the scheme. Sentencing came in November. Patricia was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution of over $400,000 to the victims of her schemes. Greg got 6 years because of his role as an attorney and his abuse of the legal system. The judge was particularly harsh in his comments, saying that Greg had betrayed the trust of his profession and had used his legal knowledge to prey on vulnerable people. The civil cases settled quickly after the criminal convictions. The HOA's insurance company paid out to all the victims, and the HOA itself was dissolved by court order. The fake liens were removed from everyone's properties, and those of us who had been targeted received compensation for our legal fees and emotional distress. As for me, I finally got to enjoy my uncle's cabin in peace. I spent Thanksgiving there that year, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee and watching the sun rise over the mountains just like I had been doing that morning when Patricia first knocked on my door. Derek came up to visit for the weekend, bringing his wife and kids. We grilled burgers and let the kids play in the creek, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could truly relax. "You know what the funny thing is?" Derek said as we sat around the campfire that evening. "If Patricia had just left you alone, she might have gotten away with everything eventually. But she got greedy. She couldn't wait for the probate to finish. She had to grab for your property right away, and that's what brought everything crashing down." "Uncle Harold would have loved this," I said, staring into the flames. "He fought them while he was alive, and even after he was gone, his cabin was the thing that finally stopped them. He'd be proud of you for not backing down." I nodded, feeling the weight of the last 10 months finally lifting off my shoulders. The cabin was mine, free and clear. The people who had tried to steal it were in prison, and the community that Patricia had terrorized was finally free from her control. I ended up making friends with several of the other property owners who had been caught up in the HOA scheme. John Stevens and I went fishing together regularly, and he taught me all the best spots on the creek. The Martins invited me over for Sunday dinners, and Rebecca Walsh hired me to help with some marketing for her auto repair business. The property values in the area actually went up after the HOA was dissolved, which was ironic considering Patricia's whole justification had been protecting property values. Turns out that people would rather live somewhere without a corrupt organization trying to steal their homes. I thought about selling the cabin once briefly when a legitimate developer made me a generous offer. But standing on the porch, looking out at the mountains and the trees and the creek, I knew I could never let it go. This place was part of my family's history, and Uncle Harold had fought to protect it. The least I could do was honor that by keeping it. I ended up quitting my job in Charlotte and moving to the cabin full-time. I started doing freelance consulting work that I could do remotely, and I fixed up the cabin room by room over the following year. I replaced the old roof, updated the plumbing, refinished the hardwood floors, and rebuilt the front porch that had been starting to sag. Every improvement I made, I thought about Uncle Harold and how much he had loved this place. I found old photographs of him in the cabin's attic, pictures from the 1980s and 90s showing him on this same porch, standing by the creek, working in the garden. I had copies made and hung them on the walls, creating a little gallery of memories. The following spring, I planted a vegetable garden in the meadow where Uncle Harold used to keep his. I didn't really know what I was doing, but John Stevens helped me figure it out, and by summer I had tomatoes, peppers, squash, and green beans growing. There was something deeply satisfying about eating food I had grown on my own land that no one could take away from me. I also got involved in local politics, attending county commission meetings and speaking out whenever issues came up about property rights and HOA regulations. The county ended up passing new ordinances that made it much harder for HOAs to expand their jurisdiction without explicit consent from property owners, and they created a complaint process for people who felt they were being harassed by their HOA. Patricia's story became something of a cautionary tale in the area. Local news outlets did follow-up stories about the case, and a couple of investigative journalists wrote detailed pieces about how HOA abuse was a growing problem across the country. I was interviewed for several of these articles, and I always made sure to emphasize that people needed to stand up for their rights and not let themselves be intimidated by official-sounding threats. Derek and I stayed close friends. He ended up specializing in HOA litigation after our case, representing property owners in disputes across North Carolina. He said that what happened with Patricia and Greg had opened his eyes to how much abuse was happening in the HOA system, and he wanted to focus his practice on protecting people from that kind of predatory behavior. 2 years after the trial, I got a letter from Patricia. It was forwarded through Derek's office because she apparently wasn't allowed to contact me directly due to the restraining order that was still in effect. In the letter, she claimed to be sorry for what had happened and said she had been under a lot of stress and had made bad decisions. She asked if I would write a letter to the parole board supporting her early release. I showed the letter to Derek and he just laughed. "Not a chance in hell, right?" "Not a chance in hell," I agreed. I wrote back through Derek, declining to provide any support for her parole, and noting that I didn't believe her apology was genuine given that she was still claiming stress as an excuse rather than taking real responsibility for her actions. Greg tried something similar about a year later, sending a letter through his own lawyer claiming that he was a changed man and had found religion in prison. His letter asked if I would consider a financial settlement, where he would pay me money in exchange for my support at his parole hearing. Derek advised me that accepting such a settlement could be considered improper, and besides, I had no interest in helping the man who had threatened to bury me in legal paperwork. The resort development that Patricia and Greg had been planning never happened. The developer Marcus Shaw ended up being investigated for his own shady dealings and lost his financing. The properties that the Hendersons had acquired were sold back to the original owners at fair market prices or sold to new buyers. The area remained a mix of older cabins and newer homes, without any coordinated development, which was exactly how most of the residents liked it. I celebrated my 3rd anniversary of living at the cabin by having a big barbecue and inviting everyone who had been involved in fighting the HOA. We had about 40 people show up, including Derek and his family, all of my fellow property owners, several of the journalists who had covered the story, and even Sandra Chen from the Attorney General's office, who had become a friend during the investigation. Standing on my newly rebuilt deck, looking out at all these people who had come together to fight corruption and protect their homes, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Uncle Harold had given me more than just property. He had given me a reason to stand up for what was right, a community of good people, and a place where I truly belonged. John Stevens raised his beer in a toast. To Harold Thompson, who never backed down from a fight, and to his nephew Lucas, who followed in his footsteps. Everyone raised their glasses and cheered. I felt tears prick at my eyes, thinking about Uncle Harold and wishing he could have been there to see how everything turned out. And to Patricia Henderson, Derek added with a wry smile, whose greed and incompetence brought down an entire criminal enterprise and made life better for everyone in this community. More laughter and cheers. Rebecca Walsh chimed in. May she enjoy her extended stay as a guest of the North Carolina Department of Corrections. The party went late into the night. We had music and dancing, kids running around catching fireflies and stories being swapped around the campfire. The Martins talked about their plans to finally take that cross-country trip they had been putting off while they fought the HOA. Rebecca announced that her auto repair business had grown so much that she was hiring 2 more mechanics and expanding her garage. John Stevens revealed that he was writing a book about his experiences fighting the HOA, hoping it would help other people who found themselves in similar situations. As people started heading home around midnight, Derek pulled me aside. You did good, Lucas. A lot of people would have just given up and walked away. You stood your ground and it made a real difference. I had a good lawyer, I said, clapping him on the shoulder. You had a good uncle who taught you what mattered. The rest was just paperwork. After everyone left and I was cleaning up the deck, I looked up at the stars. They were incredibly bright out here, away from the city lights. I could see the Milky Way stretching across the sky, just like Uncle Harold used to point out when I was a kid. We won, Uncle Harold, I said quietly to the night. Your cabin is safe, and the people who tried to take it are locked up where they belong. The wind rustled through the pine trees, and for just a moment, I could almost imagine it was him, acknowledging what I had said and giving his approval. I went inside, made sure the fire was completely out and headed to bed. Through the bedroom window I could see the moonlight reflecting off the creek, hear the water burbling over the rocks, and smell the pine-scented mountain air. This was home. This was where I belonged. And no one was ever going to take it away from me. The legal battle with Patricia and the Mountain View Estates HOA had been exhausting and stressful, but it had also been clarifying. It had shown me what really mattered in life and connected me with people who shared my values. It had given me purpose and direction when I had been drifting through a corporate job in Charlotte that never felt quite right. Uncle Harold had known exactly what he was doing when he left me this cabin. He knew I needed roots, a place to stand and fight for something real. And in fighting for his cabin, I had found exactly that. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I thought about all the weekends I had spent as a kid in this cabin, learning from Uncle Harold about hard work and integrity and standing up for what you believe in. He had been teaching me all along, preparing me for this fight without either of us knowing it. The cabin would stay in the family for generations, if I had anything to say about it. When I had kids someday, they would spend their summers here just like I had, learning to fish in the creek and chop wood and appreciate the simple beauty of mountain mornings. And I would tell them the story of how their great-great-uncle Harold stood up to bullies, and how that courage echoed forward even after he was gone. Patricia Henderson had thought she could claim an abandoned cabin and profit from it. Instead, she had run headlong into a legacy of stubborn determination and found herself completely outmatched. The probate court records had told one story, the story of legal ownership and proper inheritance. But the real story was about family, integrity, and the refusal to let greedy people steal what they had no right to take. And that story would be told around campfires and dinner tables in this community for years to come, a reminder that standing up for what is right still matters, even when it's difficult, even when it takes time, and even when you are facing people with money and power who seem unstoppable. Uncle Harold's cabin would stand for decades more, a testament to the man who built it and loved it, and to the nephew who fought to keep it. The mountains would watch over it, the creek would run beside it, and the pine trees would shelter it, just as they always had.